Good morning, Paul and Bassel. It's the 19th of October. Today, we are doing an internal brief regarding the alternative perspectives behind the conflict in Ukraine. We may release this brief to clients if it is helpful. Now, the focus of this discussion will be to critically examine some of the views and arguments raised by a select group of American scholars and experts on this very pertinent theme. Over to you, Paul, for your comments.
Well, look, I think I don't know who you've got in mind, but some of the renowned experts, I guess, include Jeffrey Sachs, possibly Colonel Douglas Macgregor, maybe even definitely John Mearsheimer, possibly also Stephen Walt. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with these gentlemen.
Yes, Paul. So, if we talk about these three, experts, so let me just give you a brief overview of their backgrounds. So, Professor Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned professor of economics. He's a leading advocate for sustainable development, a senior UN advisor, and a best-selling author. And he comes from an academic background. Contrary to him, Colonel Douglas Macgregor is a US Army veteran and former director of the Joint Operations Center at the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe. John Mearsheimer is a prominent American academic and scholar of international relations, best known for his theory of offensive realism. And just like Mearsheimer, even Stephen Walt is yet another leading political scientist and proponent of the realist tradition in the field of international relations.
Okay, so I guess what we need to do now is hone in. So really there's three academics there and a fairly seasoned military analyst. But I guess what they're starting to do is be very outspoken about the unnecessary nature of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. When the war started, it was very Russia to blame, Russia invades. But when people learn about the historical reasons for it, the expansions of NATO, very clear statements by Putin from as early as 2014, America's involvement in changing the government out to be a pro-American government, the Ukrainian government, the backflip by Zelensky when he left, where he ran on a mandate of getting peace with Russia, and then as a comedian quickly backflipped, flew to Washington, D.C., America had his back, and now there's probably in excess of 300,000 Ukrainian victims of this war, if we're ignoring civilian deaths. So what are the trends between these gentlemen's points of view? Are there any commonality in their viewpoints? Ramu?
Okay, well, so Paul, when we talk about three academics and one military analyst, so from the videos that I have listened to of them so far, I see a lot of convergences and a few divergences. So among the convergences, all four of them blames the US neoconservative ideology as the primary reason for NATO expansionism in Eastern Europe and onto the buffer with Russia. And they are also unanimous in telling that, in dismissing so-called unprovoked Russian aggression narrative, which is mostly trumpeted by the Western mainstream media and even by the US government voices. Jeffrey Sachs, that way, is somebody who's more of a pacifist. He has been advocating for a truce, with negotiations being the right way to go. Colonel Douglas Macgregor also is an advocate for diplomacy. He has suggested that negotiations and a diplomatic approach should be the primary means of solving this crisis. John Mearsheimer, he has always stuck to his realist perspective, and he believes that Russia's actions in Ukraine, including the annexation of Crimea in 2014, were driven by its desire to prevent Ukraine from aligning with the West, especially NATO. Stephen Walt views the actions of states, including Russia, Ukraine, and the Western powers, through the lens of power politics and national interests. And he has been a critique of Western policy, in which he argues that Western support for Ukrainian integration into Western institutions like the NATO and the European Union contributed to tensions with Russia and helped provoke the conflict.
Well, so that's an interesting point of view. However, I would state this: that assumes that it wasn't consciously done with the ultimate gain of preventing Russia from strengthening to become a USSR type competing superpower. So it was ultimately done very strategically. If we look at NATO growing out of the fall or the German re-amalgamation, NATO has constantly gone east in the name of peace. Well, I'm not sure how a war like Russia and Ukraine can be done in the name of peace. So it ultimately is about hegemonic American power. Now, we all know, I mean, only Blind Freddy hasn't worked out that America's, very quickly losing economic hegemonic power, but its hegemony over security across the globe maintains in theory. And by in theory, I mean, yeah, they've got a massive force, massive technology, and they can project it. But the practice of putting those forces on the ground when they project it and winning ground and changing the security paradigm has been shown to have failed many, many times now. I won't bore you or our potential listeners with an epitome of examples. I think that's very much common knowledge these days. But interestingly, Mearsheimer is really the only one of these four that you've mentioned or that we're discussing now that made his points very, very clear prior to the war. Mearsheimer was actually going around to various places lecturing. I remember a lecture he did in Europe, another he did in the States, where he very clearly said it's inevitable that the neocons are pushing for war. And now we see the neocons actually getting some of what I would call the non-biased, objective people trying to educate the world about what's going on. They're using their powers in the White House, Capitol Hill and Langley to actually cut them off YouTube, which, if that's done in China, it's suppression of the press. But if they do it, it's, of course, superior wisdom to match their elitism. And I'm afraid that the boy that cried wolf, I mean, we have another situation now where Biden's flying in, he's talking to Israel, they've deployed aircraft carrier groups near in the name of peace. I guess my question to you is, are you seeing the American ability to play the fair, impartial, democratic voice across the world is starting to perhaps wane? And is the growth of BRICS and also the Belt and Road Initiative conference in Beijing, are they indicators perhaps that the world's tiring of the American view, or do you think they still have a position of respect despite perhaps the neocons taking what is a wonderful America that everyone needs at the top of the food tree, but are the neocons potentially derailing their credibility?
Well, Paul, I believe that the neocon fixation with exporting American or Western liberal values elsewhere without taking into consideration the indigenous context is a very plain and very less research method. For that matter, even the exploitation of the sanctions regime has persuaded many countries in the global south to come about with or to discuss mechanisms that can circumvent the exposure of their companies and their banking networks to the US Federal Reserve. So despite the fact that the BRICS does not boast a very cohesive framework, mostly because of the differences between China and India, but there is a lot of resonance in terms of agreeing that Western sanctions have become a common threat to all these countries, and there needs to be a robust mechanism to de-dollarize or to diversify away from the excess dependence on the US dollar as the primary foreign exchange.
But I'd say that those points of unity go way beyond de-dollarization. I think they're also ethic and value based. I think they're also more fair trade based. I hate to say it, less oppressive colonial attitudes, more where it's geographical and financially suitable to do so, easier removing barriers that are all apparently imposed under a central banking system for the good of the world. But I think we can all see through that little folly. Bassel, you've been notoriously quiet today, which is unusual. Have you had a heart attack, or would you like to chime in?
If I can jump in here, Paul, it's been an interesting discussion between you and Ramu. I actually agree with you on the point about BRICS expansionism as well as the de-dollarization. The thing is that I think BRICS has an advantage as it boasts itself as an economic alliance rather than a security alliance, and actually a security expansionist alliance like NATO does. So, concerning the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the issues about the unprovoked Russian aggression narrative that has been propaganded by Western media. So, if you talk to Westerners, they'll often believe that the conflict started with a Russian aggression. However, the conflict started way back in 2008 when NATO invited Ukraine to join the alliance. So the ability of Western media to propagate these things on a 24/7 basis for sure will affect American diplomacy and American trust across the world.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'm not sure you'll have to check this out, but I think it was Stephen Walt that he actually exposes ignorance of Washington's Euro-Atlanticist in some of his talks and papers, but he underscores how liberal interventionists, unrepentant neoconservatives, and a handful of progressives who are just too gung-ho over issues not only but like Ukraine, but also Syria and a myriad of other examples. But they seem to have no doubt whatsoever about the origins of the conflict, Walt and other academics, nor do they have any doubt about the proper course of actions that should be followed today. Of course, the neocons want war in the name of peace, which is kind of ironic. They want everything to be in their economic and security favour. But Bassel, I don't think when you have organisations with the number of nations wanting to join BRICS, these often start as an economic-based group or even a groups with some aligned common values and common purpose. But ultimately, I don't think you can actually separate security from that. Ultimately, when your values and your economic welfare gets challenged by the agendas of the others, that's ultimately what can often lead to security tensions and potential for conflict or even conflict, and that's when countries come together. You've only got to look at what drove Japanese to go into the Second World War and the First World War, the catalyst behind that. But often these are economic issues that empower people behind a particular cause or a value, right or wrong. But these economic blocks tend to become security blocks on the long term. And even if you look at NATO's supposedly, an Atlantic Treaty Organization, well, really? Okay, but the whole world's sending weapons to NATO at the moment if they're aligned with America. Australia blindly supports America regardless of economic impacts to ourselves. One would think that that's very moral and very righteous, but ultimately you have to question the sanity and the wisdom of doing that. I mean, it's easy to go, oh, everything China's bad, everything America's good, but if we actually listen to the ad hoc media releases and speaking out by Blinken and the other State Department, I'm going to call them cronies, and we then compare that against the black and white fresh releases that seem to be very well considered and released and stuck by and don't get backflipped. And I'm talking about the foreign affairs departments of the Soviet Union and China. They seem to issue a lot clearer points of view. They tend to actually stick by their word. It's hard to follow America. It was only 10 days ago, can't remember who it was, but one of the American State Department guys was on the TV showing the Middle East has never been so stable and so secure. And, the very next day, Hamas cruise into Israel like they're waltzing into a Boy Scouts camp because it was almost unsecured. Of course, it's at a time when Israel's pushing for basically kicking back on an independent judiciary. So you had members of the reserves, believe it or not, on strike. So, meanwhile, the State Department saying how incredibly secure it is now. You've got Hezbollah joining Hamas you've got Israel indiscriminately bombing the Gaza Strip. You've got 2-odd million people that are innocent caught up with it. And you've got Iran not listening to America's chest puffing and their show of force that can't be perceived to be anything rational if you're looking for a peaceful outcome. So, Basil, I guess the point I'm making is I don't see the world getting safer or better under American leadership. I see it splintering, becoming harder to manage. America's big fist and iron power has probably been overplayed. Their shows of force and their smooth tongues that emulate out of Capitol Hill, the White House, and even the inputs they get from Langley, they really do seem to be the boy that cried wolf to a large degree, which is sad because America has been such a wonderful superpower, and we need a wonderful superpower. The world's a lot better when we have a wonderful superpower. But there are internal clashes in the States between blue and red, a pending election where it may not be metaphoric clashes, it could be more physical clashes like the last election. Where do you think that's heading, Basil? Do you think Messrs. Walt and Mearsheimer and McGregor and Sachs are perhaps the vanguard for some more rational debate, opening some eyes up that are contrary to what is really biased bollocks coming out of the Western media and even out of the Western nation spokesmen? I saw today the Scottish First Minister's mother-in-law's Palestinian, and he released to YouTube that she's in tears, can't cross the border because the border crossing's closed, can't get out. He, basically released a family talk so that the world could actually learn that a group punishment for 2 million people may not be the ideal way of defending yourself. That would be probably ill-considered offensive actions. Meanwhile, British and Aussie special forces are in trouble, and rightfully so, for killing some innocent people. We're talking a few. Israel's over the years done tens of thousands. So how's the world rationalising this, Basil, you think? Are these guys the vanguard that's going to start educating everybody against their own bias, or do you think people are unmovable in terms of they have a position on Israel and Palestine and never the twain shall meet?
Well, Paul, the Israeli-Palestinian issue has been highly controversial, especially in the US. According to some latest poll I've checked, an opinion poll, 41% of Americans still believe that America should support Israel. Around 2% think that America should support Palestine. So these, the authors that we mentioned and Colonel Douglas McGregor, if they try to challenge the Western media propaganda that's propagated from the European Union as well as the US, they may change a bit in people's opinions about this issue. However, the larger spectrum is that most people still support the US supporting Israel rather than Palestine. However, there is also a controversial side to that, that they say Israel has the right to defend itself, but at the same time, it's provoking or it's actually bombarding Gaza, leading to mass civilian casualties, which is against international law and against the Geneva Convention and against and is considered as a war crime. So actually, I wanted to add something about Western media propaganda. When Russian aggression or when the Russian invasion started in Ukraine, the European Commission actually and its president Ursula von der Leyen have talked about how Russia cut electricity, water, and food from Ukraine. However, when Israel did that to Gaza, we didn't listen to anything from the European Commission and especially its president. So I think it's a double standard, and I think they only support what works for their needs and goals.
Yes, and I think we can expect that various analysts, because people always look at analysis as a risk-based security thing, but of course, smart money has to analyse and has to move in advance of the mass movements of money. So I think we're going to see the growth of BRICS will be a greater catalyst than academics in America, because that will impact everybody's lives as the global economies start to split, movement of money diversifies, trade diversifies. India perhaps in life after Modi rationalises a little bit more as a reasonable democracy where the media isn't controlled by the guy that's running the country. But as India and China and the re-emerging Russia and some of the other BRIC nations start to unify, I think that's going to have a lot larger effect on people suddenly starting to feel issues economically and then question their leadership. But look, let's wind it up now. I've got a couple of things I need to move on to. Thanks wonderfully for the chat, Ramu and Bassel. And next week, Bassel, I might ask you to give the entire team a rundown. Obviously, you're Lebanese living in Turkey, but if you could give the whole team a rundown, I know you know a lot about the history of the Palestine-Israel situation. I think we all do to a degree, but I think it's time we pulled it together and did a formal brief. We've got a few new people on board and make sure that everybody's got that base of understanding from which we can analyse the scenario and add more value to our clients. Okay?
Yes, sure, Paul. I would love to do that. Thanks.
Right. Excellent, Bassel. Excellent, Dr. Ramu. Thanks, gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Paul. Likewise.